Welcome back to Southern Ghost Stories. I'm your host, the American Hauntstorian, Alan Searcy. Today's podcast is brought to you by Pickled Treats and Antiques in Gallatin, Tennessee. Pickled Treats is a one-of-a-kind antique store. It's also incredibly haunted. If you have a paranormal team looking for a fun place to investigate, reach out to Pickled Treats and Antiques and Shauna Blittle on Facebook. Her rates are reasonable, and it's a very active location. Once again, it's Pickled Treats and Antiques. You can find them on Facebook. So last week, I did 2 shows on some eerie tales from St. Louis. If you enjoyed them, please check out my book, Ghost Stories from Graveyard Tales St. Louis. Well, today, we're going back to my old stomping grounds in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll talk about Barrow Hill. Born in 1784 to a prominent family in North Carolina, Matthew Barrow moved to Georgia as a young man before settling in Middle Tennessee in the mid-1800s. During that time, Nashville's population exploded as the city rode the wave of economic prosperity due to the bustling steamboat ports along Front Street. Matthew saw opportunities and began buying up lots in West Nashville. At his peak, Barrow owned over 500 acres in the area. To maintain his property and tend to his fields, the Barrows owned numerous slaves. The family had so many enslaved men and women that Barrow rented them out to neighboring plantations in the summertime. As a man of means, Matthew Barrow was a highly respected man in Nashville. He was also elected and served as a Davidson County Register of Deeds. In the early 1850s, Matthew built a 3-story brick home on top of one of the tallest hills in Nashville that overlooked Charlotte Pike. Over the years, the property became known as Barrow Hill. Matthew lived in the house with his wife Martha and their 5 children. Sadly, Matthew wasn't around long enough to enjoy his new mansion. He passed away in the house on May 28, 1855, and he was laid to rest in the family cemetery behind the home. When the Federal Army began their occupation of Nashville in 1862, the large home on Barrow Hill was seized and used as a lookout post and hospital, as well as a prison for captured Confederate soldiers. According to Barrow's servants, Union soldiers often killed unruly rebel prisoners that were treated and held in the home. Afterwards, the remains of the rebels were thrown down a well behind the kitchen. One former Barrow slave that lived on the grounds claimed to see Federal soldiers throw at least 10 bodies in at one time. In addition to the Confederates that were thrown into the well, numerous Union soldiers died in the house while being treated in the mansion. They were also buried there on the hill. The Barrow house sat empty for many years after the war. In 1878, the city of Nashville rented the mansion and used it as a hospital to treat those infected with cholera and yellow fever. So naturally, a lot of folks died there. Once the city was done with the Barrow house, it sat empty for many years. In 1885, a local attorney, Thomas Steger, bought the place and the adjoining 40 acres. Steger was a prominent citizen who entered the war as a private and made his way to captain before he was captured. While in a federal prison, Steger began studying law, and after the war, moved to Nashville to start his practice. Steger was one of Nashville's finest legal minds who parlayed his success into a gig as president of the Nashville Railway and Light Company. Due to all the years of neglect, Steger spent a fortune renovating the old home. One of his upgrades was an ornate circular stairway that rose from the first floor all the way to the 3rd. Captain Steger installed a massive carved paneled oak front door that contained painted glass. He also installed a dozen 6-foot-high glass windows so his friends and family could enjoy a breathtaking view of Nashville's early skyline. In addition to the cosmetic changes, with the help of his company, Steger installed some of the first electric lights in Nashville there in his new home. At the turn of the century, the Stegers moved out, and a less reputable individual moved in. Noted bootlegger Jim Arnold and his wife Clara moved into the old Barrow mansion and began running a house of ill fame. That's a fancy word for brothel. After 2 local men were charged with adultery, they admitted that they had been spending their evenings at Barrow Hill. Police began to monitor the house to keep an eye on Arnold and any possible illegal activities that took place in the home. Just after midnight on July 16th, 1916, Police Sergeant John Milleran led officers Joe Ferris and Michael Bracey to Barrow Hill after neighbors called in complaining of some alleged disorderly conduct that was taking place in the home that night. Sergeant Milleran was known for his boldness and apprehended many dangerous men in perilous situations. For his bravery, other officers started calling him Tiger, which eventually was shortened to Tige. When the police arrived, Tige ordered Officer Ferris to go to the back of the house, and Officer Bracey went to the front of the house, or to the side of the house. Sergeant Milleran was going to go into the front door and wanted his men to cover him from the rear and side. Tige went through the front door, and he banged loudly. To his surprise, he was greeted by Arnold, who was carrying a single-barrel shotgun. Tige explained there were some complaints earlier in the evening, and he wanted to know if it was okay to come inside and look around. Initially, Jim refused, but before he knew it, the fearless police sergeant pushed him aside and barged into his home. As Arnold protested, Tige stormed through the parlor and into the master bedroom, where he found Claire Arnold lying in bed. Enraged that a police officer was walking around their house, Claire began screaming at her husband to shoot the intruder. Sergeant Milleran walked back into the parlor and continued his tour of the house. As soon as the lawman crossed the threshold into the parlor, the thunderous sounds of gunshots erupted through the old cavernous home. Unbeknownst to Jim Arnold, Officer Ferris, who had been watching him argue with Tige through a back window. When things appeared to be getting out of hand, Ferris fired at Arnold and then climbed into a window to check on Sergeant Milleran. As Ferris made his way through the large, murky house, he began to hear the sounds of approaching footsteps. Thinking that Jim Arnold was coming after him, the officer called out and ordered whoever was coming his way to stop immediately. Unfortunately, the footsteps only became more hurried and louder. Fearing for his life, Officer Ferris fired blindly into the hallway and struck Officer Bracey, who he thought was Jim Arnold. Bracey had been shot in the right shoulder, but fortunately, he wasn't severely injured. Room by room, Bracey and Ferris went through the house until they discovered Clara Arnold crying in the parlor. There on the floor, they discovered Tige and Jim lying in a puddle of crimson. Tige was dead from a shotgun wound to the back of the neck, and Jim was unconscious after being shot in the stomach. When authorities arrived on the scene, Jim and Clara Arnold were placed under arrest and then taken to the hospital. While in the medical facility, Jim denied shooting Sergeant Milleran. Yet Clara slipped up and told detectives that her husband acted in self-defense and only fired at Tige after he started cursing at them in their bedroom. Officer Bracey, on the other hand, testified that he was certain that Sergeant Milleran didn't fire at Arnold. In fact, when his gun was examined, authorities found that the gun had not been fired that night. When Jim and Clara Arnold went on trial for murder, he testified that when he greeted Sergeant Milleran at the door, he carried a shotgun. But in his defense, people had been stealing lumber from behind his house. According to Jim, as he accompanied the policeman through the house, he held a lamp in his right hand and was resting the shotgun barrel on his left shoulder. As he left the bedroom, shots rang out and his gun exploded. Jim Arnold insisted that he and Tige were walking through the parlor. He heard a gunshot and his shotgun was knocked out of his hands. In the chaos, the gun discharged and struck Sergeant Milleran in the back of the neck. According to Jim, Officer Ferris caused the death of John Milleran, not him. Backing up his claim, defense's attorneys presented Jim's shotgun as evidence. And like Jim had testified, buried deep in the stock of the gun was a bullet. When the trial went to jury, Claire was found not guilty of being an accomplice to murder. Jim, however, was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Jim Arnold's representation immediately filed an appeal and requested a new trial. Fearing a new trial could exonerate Jim, the district attorney struck a deal with the Arnold's attorneys. In exchange for dropping the appeal, Jim received a sentence of 2 to 10 years. So today, the spectacular view of Nashville skyline remains, but the old house is gone. On May 14, 1920, the mansion on Barrow Hill burned to the ground after a stove exploded. Helpless firemen had no choice but to watch the house go up in flames when the horses pulling the heavy fire engines couldn't climb the steep hill. A short time later, remains of those buried in the Barrow family cemetery on top of the hill were dug up and exhumed. They were reinterred and a family plot in Mount Olivet Cemetery. However, the bodies of slaves and fallen soldiers are likely still up there. Currently, the land on top of Barrow Hill is being developed and is going to become a subdivision. So about the ghost stories. During Reconstruction, the Barrow house sat vacant for many years. For young men that lived in the area, it became a rite of passage to sneak into the old creepy mansion and spend the night. Those that were brave enough to make it until dawn talked about hearing strange noises during their stay. According to them, the house was peaceful during the day, but when the sun went down, they began to hear chains rattling, wailing, crying, and painful, awful groans. In 1884, a reporter for the Tennessean, the local newspaper, was contacted by a man who had seen a ghostly lady without a head less than 2 miles away from Barrow Hill. Obviously wanting to see what all the hype was about, the reporter met with the man late one night there on Barrow Hill. When he arrived, he found 16 other men who had come hopefully to catch a glimpse of the mysterious woman without a head. As the newspaper man sat around for a few hours, he interviewed every man on the stakeout and learned that most of them had seen the headless female, who was roughly 5 feet tall, that glided across the ground without ever making a sound. That night, the reporter waited for a few hours with the others, but he never saw the headless woman. The tales from the Barrow Hill are legendary, but the only first-hand recollection of an alleged ghost sighting was covered by the Tennessean years later. William Steger, the son of Thomas Steger, who I mentioned earlier, he told a reporter about his lone paranormal experience that took place in the house in the late 19th century when he was a teenager. Late one summer night, William was half asleep, drifting in and out of conscience. As he was trying to go to sleep, a tall, menacing white figure with one yellow eye began to stir. When the phantom noticed William watching him, it slowly began sauntering to the side of his bed. As the mysterious entity got closer and closer, the young man pulled out a revolver from his pillow and began firing blindly in the night. As the shots rang out through the house, a mirror in the corner of the room exploded and shards of glass rained down on the floor. Looking back, William Steger believed what he thought was a spirit was actually the moon's reflection off a window onto a curtain. Although he didn't see a ghost on Barrow Hill, I can only imagine what people who move into the homes where the mansion once stood will now experience, with the graves being right underneath them. Anyway, if you want to learn more about ghost stories in Nashville, I actually have 4 different books about the hauntings of Music City. I worked on a Nashville book for years, and one night I sat down and I realized I had 700 pages. And that's just too big of a book. That's like the size of a Bible. It's quite intimidating to read a book that thick. So I decided to break it up. I had a book about Opryland, which is in, East Nashville. It's an old haunted theme park. I did downtown Nashville, South Nashville, and West Nashville. Still working on North and East. If you have some good ghost stories in North and East Nashville, hit me up. Anyway, but the Nashville books, Southern Ghost Stories, Nashville books can be found on Amazon. Also at Barnes & Noble. The books are also available on Kindle, and they're free to read if you have Kindle Unlimited. All my books are available there. So please like the video on YouTube and subscribe to the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. You can find me over at Twitter. I'm at ATO Allen, ATOALLEN. I drop some ghost stories, rubbing tales, and put the podcast on there. So I'll be in Johnson City this weekend at Smoky Mountain Terror. Stop by and say hello. It's going to be a really cool horror convention. Lots of guests there and are making appearances from old horror movies. I'll be there signing books and talking to folks, so stop by and say hello. And check back next time. I'm going to do a show about old ghost stories in my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee. One more time, just for fun. I'll see you then.